Hi, I'm Judy Herzog from Fairfield. I'm a fanatic quilter. This is Shirley Thompson. She is also a fanatic quilter, and this is Joanne Fritz. She's the source of our fanaticism. She owns the sewing room on the west side of Fairfield. In October of 1994, the Grout Museum in Waterloo issued quilters of Iowa and the surrounding areas a challenge. They said, we're going to be 150 years old, make us a wall quilt and use these two fabrics. The fabrics were chosen because they are from a design by two quilters from Iowa. I don't know of anyone that opened that little package and said, oh boy, we're going to have fun with this. They chose a brown to represent the earth and a green to represent Iowa's vegetation. So it truly was a challenge. 107 quilters responded to this challenge, and in October of 1995, they hung at the Grout Museum in Waterloo, and by viewer's choice, 65 were chosen as winners. 2 traveling exhibits were set up. We have an exhibit of 50 quilts that's going to be here in Fairfield, and we would like to show them to you. So this is Iowa, a place to sew, the Iowa Sesquicentennial Quilt Challenge, created by the Grout Museum, Waterloo, Iowa. In addition to the sponsors on the screen, the Iowa State Bank in Fairfield, the Fairfield Art Association, and the Northside Strippers Quilt Club were sponsors of this exhibit.
Our first quilt is Threads Through Time. It's done by Lynne, Patti of Humboldt, Iowa. It's a traditionally pieced quilt and the threads of Iowa. It does make sense that in olden times our friendships were made by sewing together. Our next quilt is Land, Rivers, and People. It depicts Iowa, 1846 through 1996. In many of the quilts you'll find they have picked our state flower, the wild rose, our state bird, the goldfinch, and then things that do point out what is important to Iowa, the agriculture, the cities. This one was designed by Phyllis Benson of Rock Island, Illinois, and it's an original design. This next quilt is Heart to Heart by Paula Meyer of Denver, Iowa. It's a contemporary quilt design. It's a form of a log cabin. You just use strips to make the quilt designs. Quilting of today is far different than in olden days. We use strip quilting opposed to cutting out block by block, and it's much easier to do. This one is called Bridging Our Land and Our Lives Together. It's by Deborah of Storm Lake, Iowa. It's traditionally pieced. The areas of solid blue in this quilt represent our lakes and rivers. The flying geese border symbolized the migration of people to Iowa in the 1980s. Lots of nice work done on that quilt. This one is Iowa is So Fantastic. It's by Tanis Diedrichs of Cedar Falls, Iowa. It was 3rd place in the applique division. Our oak leaf is our state tree, so this represents the state tree. The rose seems to be the vintage fabric reminder of the wild rose, Iowa State's flower.
This quilt was made by Sandy Voss of Cedar Falls, called the Cedar Valley Signature Quilt. The signatures on the quilt represent an entire population of the Cedar Valley area in 1846. There is a nice variety of colors and interesting detail on this quilt. Fans and flowers created by Ethel Taylor Jordan of Corydon, Iowa. On here, this quilt, you can see some pretty good examples of the fabric that Judy mentioned earlier. Here is the brown representing the soil, and the green that represents the vegetation. Ethel said, Iowa's been a good place for me to grow up and a place to learn to sew. I always feel as though I'm holding hands with the past as I plan and stitch a quilt to be used now and in the future. Symbols of Iowa by Joanne Stout of Washington, Iowa, won second place in the applique division. She chose to feature the wild rose and the goldfinch in her use of this fabric. Iowa Sweet Memories, Iowa, A Place to Sew is Shirley Peterson's design from Davenport, Iowa. She said this quilt captivates some fond memories of the quilters of her new life in Iowa after living in Illinois. If you can see on the detail, she is coming across the Centennial Bridge in a red pickup truck with her sewing machine loaded up behind, all ready to go. And they are moving into a Iowa farm scene with the corn and rural landscape.
This is Celebrating Iowa with Needle and Thread, Marty Freed, Winterset, Iowa. Original design. If you notice here, the eagle is holding a little ribbon that says Iowa, A Place to Sew, 1846 and 1996. It's a peach quilt, very nicely done. This is a glimpse of Iowa, Shelley Cornwall, Waterloo, Iowa. It portrays Iowa in its earliest settlement times. Quilting was one of the ways women provided warmth for their loved ones. The Iowa woman and her quilting were definitely a part of Iowa's past. Take special note in this one, the 28 stars in the border is for Iowa is the 29th state to join the Union. And it's applique and pieced. It's a mixed quilt. This wall quilt is done in, it's called a cathedral window pattern. Now this is much of it done by hand because each of these little pieces has to be hand stitched down. And when Richard pans back, I want you to notice the I in the center she put for the state of Iowa. Carolyn Reef Snyder, Bellevue, Iowa. Heartland Celebration. Here we have another mixed piece with both applique and piecing done by Diane Idy, Shannon City, Iowa. Stitches in Time. This quilt helps to show that although countless quilters have gone before us, the art of quilt making in Iowa lives on as we continue to make Iowa a place to sew. And this obviously is some of her heritage. Do you see Grandma sitting there quilting? My Iowa Sewing Basket by Alice Nadine Craycraft, Ridgeway, Missouri. Mixed technique with both piecing and applique. She has spools and a little pincushion and of course Iowa corn and the flower, the wild rose. And her sewing basket is all done in three-dimensional. You'll see a little spool here and a little old spool of thread and little antique scissors done very nicely with a little goldfinch above it.
This quilt is entitled Iowa, My Place to Sew, made by Donna Landman of Davenport, Iowa, and it's a mixed technique. She has applique as well as piecing, satin stitch, and she has done also with some machine stitching on here, just to show some of the recent techniques that can be used in stitching. She has made some little quilt blocks that are just still hanging loose on here. They're not even completely attached down. And her symbolism is of wallpaper, looks great, like you're looking out on a farm scene. It's a very, very attractive quilt. Lace curtains are shown at the window at the very top. It's a very clever quilt. Full Circle is the name of this quilt, done by Lois Morse of Cedar Falls, Iowa. It's a mixed technique also. The quilt has a simple strippy pattern that was popular in the 1846. The fabrics used here are reproduction fabrics that are in the same prints and colors that might have been available and popular in that era. And Beth Geisman of Waverly, Iowa, created Iowa Farm, and that was because of the history and heritage of farming in the state. The border here are called pinwheels, and that pattern may represent the windmills that have been seen throughout the state of Iowa. This particular design is called Flying Geese, that comes down the right side of the quilt, and that is apparent in our natural wildlife settings. And a sample of early 1850s quilt blocks was done by Ruth Hansen of Titonka, Iowa. It's traditionally pieced. These are blocks that were very often used by the quilters at that time. Just to name one, this is a log cabin, and it was a very popular block, various star and pinwheel patterns. And here again you see the use of the brown and the green fabric that was required for this quilt challenge. This is a fun quilt. It's entitled Football is for the Birds, made by Margie DeBauer of Decorah, Iowa. She says that she started this quilt on a Super Bowl Sunday with a group of friends, and they weren't interested in the Super Bowl, so they made a quilt. They managed to use a little bit of the green and brown fabric that we all thought was part of an extreme challenge to make it look good. It's done very well, and it's a very handsome wall hanging. Next we have Prairie Compass. This won the first place in the traditional piece division by Viewer's Choice. This quilt represents the different directions our lives take according to the choices we make. One choice being the decision to settle in Iowa like the settlers of the 1800s. Here again she has used a variety of reproduction fabrics I recognize. The green and the brown are used in here. It's very striking, and lots of nice little quilting stitches are in the background that might be a little hard to see on camera, but in real are very pretty.
This quilt is titled Iowa, the Place I Sew and Play. It's by Mary Howard of Cedar Falls, Iowa. The antique rabbit pull toys. I think there has been rabbits in Iowa for 150 years also. My quilt is taken from a pattern, Folk Heart Rabbits by Mum's the Word. It's a fun thing to look at and enjoy. This quilt, Becky Burr Schultz of Waverly, Iowa, says 150 years of Iowa, is represented in the hole in the barn door, which is the pattern of this quilt block. And an opening to the future depicts a view of Iowa's fields. This quilt says many, many things to me. The title is For All Seasons. It's by Cynthia John of Toledo, Iowa. The silhouette of this quilt is to represent all quilters past, present, and future, contemplating the strengths of our communities and the contributions each make in the seasons of our lives and time. But we have the home, we have our schools, we have agriculture, and we have our church, which is all should be all important to all of us. This one is Pella Tulip and Beyond. It's by Midge Graves of Chariton, Iowa. The Pella Tulip pattern interprets the theme of the Quilt Challenge, since Pella, Iowa is located in our state and is a part of the Dutch heritage. This one is Grandmother's Flower Basket by Juanita Seward of Wellman, Iowa. It's third place in the traditionally pieced grouping. I live in Iowa and definitely put a lot of sewing into this piece to make it look as old as Iowa. It really was a challenge. Thanks for the opportunity to participate. I hope it makes you smile. This is a very difficult pattern to piece, and she's done a nice job with it.
This little wall quilt is called Tumblers of Old by Janiece Goy, Cedar Falls, Iowa. When Richard pans into this one, I want you to notice how small the pieces are, and it's all scraps like Grandma used to make. Open up the scrap bag and make a quilt. It's just a traditional piece and hand quilted. This quilt is called Hoff Homestead, Doris Hall, Ames, Iowa. This quilt represents the family's settlement in Iowa a year before statehood. This quilt speaks of clearing the land, building a home, and taking needle thread and fabric scraps to build a quilt. And now we have Scrap Pineapple, Jolene from LaPorte City, Iowa. You'll have to come up and check her last name. Second place, traditional piece. Since the pineapple is a symbol of hospitality, this quilt is to symbolize Iowa's hospitality to the wide diversity of cultures that are found in the state.
Needling Across the Years in Iowa was made by Carol Thomas of Corydon, Iowa. It's an original design. This quilt depicts our Iowa sewing sisters as they make their way into Iowa, headed west to establish homesteads. Many ladies gathered not only to quilt but enjoy companionship. Quilting was a great social event in early pioneer years. It was a chance to get together and exchange news and information about the neighborhood and families. And she's suggesting that this was possibly done in a setting like this. Pastoral Piece or Piece, a play on words. This is a mixed technique quilt done by June Hoagland of Aurora, Iowa. The quilt is a panorama of the good life in a more simple, more gentle time. King corn encompasses it all. She's used a fabric with little ears of corn to emphasize the border. Here again is the green and the brown that were required to be used in here. So the stitches commemorate this heritage of quilting as a part of that life. And she's used a real rural, gentle Iowa countryside scene. She has, instead of quilting here, used a tying, which is little knots of thread instead of little quilting stitches, which are shown here as opposed to the knots here.
This quilt is Country Garden Baskets. It's by Darla Jo Hanks of Forest City, Iowa. She says this quilt was made with the intention of having 1840s appearance. The idea of a basket quilt helps to show how Iowa is the breadbasket of the country. It's a very nice quilt. There are many basket patterns that could be used. She's chosen a nice one.
This quilt is called We Bid Them Welcome, made by Laura Stevens of Marshalltown, Iowa. It's traditionally pieced. The pineapple block in the center is absolutely tradition, as well as the blocks around the edge being of a log cabin nature. The greens and golds of the pineapple block symbolize the prairie grass that the wagon wheels bent towards the west as the pioneers traveled Iowa, and they met the challenges with a celebration of an adventurous spirit.
This quilt is entitled Iowa, A Place to Sew by Marilyn Wellman of Keosauqua, Iowa. It is the celebrity judge's choice. It is an original design. The quilt symbolizes a state where all cultures and ideas come together at harvest time with the influence of our heritage from Iowa's beginning to our growth of today. In each county, Marilyn has tried to depict something that was important in that county. You can see here the hot air balloon for Indianola, our state capital. Books of learning for Ames in Boone County, the covered bridges, and of course hay, cattle, and those types of things are in many counties.
I want you to see this quilt only because it was made by a man, Fields of Dreams in Iowa, Ray N. Cook from Annandale, Virginia. And the interesting thing about this quilt is, Richard, I want you to show the Iowa. The background of Iowa is what we call scraps from the cutting room floor. They take little bitty pieces of fabric and just stitch them down, so you get kind of a mosaic look to it. And then, of course, all the stuff that he thought was important to Iowa is appliqued around the edge. This is Thomas Nast's Santa and Me by Judy Herzog. How about that? When I saw this fabric, I was one of them that said, oh my gosh, I can't do anything with this. But I love Santas, and this is how Santa would have looked to the children in 1846 when Iowa became a state. He was a fat little elf dressed in red underwear. And it wasn't until the Coca-Cola artist got a hold of him that he turned into a life-size Santa that we know today. It's applique and with a pieced border. Thomas Nast was a political satirist for Harper's Magazine back when Abraham Lincoln was the president. And he's the one that drew this little fella.
This is my offering for the challenge. I, like others, couldn't quite decide what to do with the green and brown, but I chose to border the quilt rather boldly with it. So it is here, and you can see it. My technique is called watercolor. It's using little 2-inch squares of fabric and blending the colors together to form a picture or design. In this case, there's a contrast of a light background, and then the state itself is basically dark, a little bit towards the light in the center. The little squares depict things that are prominent in Iowa, or evident in Iowa at least, all the way from snowmen to blocks that represent learning, the churches. How about a few quilts on a clothesline? Our favorite flower, the dandelion. This piece of fabric right here is swirling, and I thought of the tornadoes that Iowa has experienced. Some good times, some bad times, hiking and camping. I used a blue fabric to put on the river, and someone later said, gee, you should have used brown. This is something what could be Iowa from the air if you could get high enough.
This quilt is Quilted Fields by Carol Floyd of West Des Moines, Iowa. It was second place in the mixed technique. It's a very brightly colored quilt, and it does depict an Iowa scene with haystacks of thread, a pincushion field, and a measuring tape road. The scissors tree offers her shade. She's very busy down on her hands and knees, basting the quilt. This quilt is entitled Iowa's Golden Corn. It's done by Rosalie Baker of Davenport, Iowa. It was the first place in original design. This quilt depicts Iowa as the state for people, golden corn, farms, and industry. Of course, Grant Wood's American Gothic is a part of Iowa's history to always remember. She has most every symbol that says Iowa on this quilt. The wild rose, the goldfinch, the corn, even a corn border. One of the reasons we are here is not only to entertain you, but also to encourage you to come to our quilt show. The Northside Strippers will have their quilt show at the Jefferson County Fairgrounds, and our dates are Saturday, October 26th from 10 to 6 p.m. and then on Sunday from 11 to 4.
And you will also have a chance to win this beautiful quilt behind us. We're going to give it away on Sunday at 3:45. A $1 donation ticket will give you a chance to win it.
And the proceeds from this quilt raffle will go to our Fairfield Library, so it stays local.
We hope you've enjoyed our tour of the Grout Museum collection. We did not have time to show you everything that is on display here, so we hope you will come to the second floor of the Iowa State Drive-In Bank Building and view the rest of the show. The hours of the show are going to be from 4 to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday, and 2 to 4 p.m. on Saturday and Sunday. The weekend of the Fairfield Sesquicentennial, the hours will coincide with the quilt show on Saturday 10 to 6 and on Sunday 11 to 4. Thank you very much for your watching our presentation.